You think working men just threw together whatever was lying around? Think again. From factory floors to coal mines, these meals fueled America's backbone with ingenuity and flavors born from necessity. Let's dig into 60 old-school working man's lunches no one makes anymore. Baked potato bar was the Great Depression gem that turned a humble spud into a customizable feast. As we've learned so far, potatoes were one of the cheapest groceries back in the day, so they were widely available. This made them the perfect base for a meal. You'd bake a bunch of potatoes until they were soft and fluffy, then set up a bar of sorts with whatever toppings you could scrape together. Butter, leftover veggies, a sprinkle of cheese, or even some canned beans all worked to turn that plain potato into something exciting. This do-it-yourself approach lets everyone in the family get creative with their toppings, making mealtime fun, even with limited options. The best part is that potatoes play as a blank canvas in this recipe. You could add whatever you thought fit the best. So even if you ate them every day, you wouldn't get tired of them and they'd still be interesting. A baked potato bar was the ultimate budget-friendly meal that let you feel like you were in control of the lunch. Well, as much as you could be during the Great Depression. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives. But the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South in African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? So we're not done with the toasts just yet. Pork and beans on buttered toast was arguably the lifeblood of 1960s frugal eating. It was a simple and cheap meal that was very popular even from the 1940s, and while baked beans on toast was something that people always associated with New England and immigrant cuisine, baked beans on toast actually became something that Americans took very fondly to. It was thanks to the act of mixing canned pork and beans in there, and these beans would already be seasoned and sweetened. Thank you, Campbell's. This dish was something you would see in mining communities really often. You would also see them in mill towns. You didn't need any sort of prep work for this dish whatsoever. All you had to do was just pop open the can and heat it up. You could make a sandwich out of it too, or you could have it as a side to some stew and dip it in. People ate very different and interesting things back then, not just to keep everything according to budget, but also so that things would just taste better, be healthier, you know? People really used to treat their food like fuel back in the day. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. Cornmeal mush with gravy was one of the best things families living in the Great Plains could hope for. The gravy wasn't just something they threw in for the sake of it, to fill themselves up. It actually added a lot and made the cornmeal significantly better. It really brought out the flavor that was already there, and getting your money's worth was never really an issue with this dish. Cornmeal was something that was so regional that a lot of families just ended up growing up on it exclusively. It was pretty hard to get an affordable meal for yourself back then, but things like this made it just a bit easier to manage. You could even buy cornmeal from your local stores for barely a few cents a pound, so that made it even easier for people living in urban areas and hubs to get it. One of the best advantages of cornmeal was that you didn't have to have an oven or a stove to make something of it. You could just as easily do it over an open fire too. This mush, for example, was something most people made without any kind of kitchen appliances. Homemade vegetable pancakes were a Depression-era favorite for stretching limited ingredients. The beauty of pancakes in general is that you could throw in anything you had lying around, from vegetables and fruits to nuts and chocolate. But for veggie pancakes, people usually turned to carrots, potatoes, onion, and zucchinis. They were a great way to get something warm and filling on the table without needing a lot of ingredients. They were easy to make, cheap, and full of flavor thanks to the caramelized veggies. They could be served for breakfast, lunch, or dinner since they were so versatile. Plus, they were a sneaky way to get kids to eat their vegetables. Anything in pancake form will be eaten in a matter of seconds. These homemade vegetable pancakes were a resourceful way to show just how creative people could get in hard times. And on the upside, they were fun to make and even more fun to eat. Let's take a moment and admire the moms of the last century. They were creative, never failing in trying to make their kids healthy and happy. Always on the go, always trying to make the best possible meals for entire families. These homemade vegetable pancakes are the perfect example of that. I mean, just thinking about putting veggies in pancakes makes me want to barf. But hey, when all you had in your pantry were veggies, you had to make some use of them. Crackers, I mean, sure, they're pretty good even as a typical easygoing breakfast, but what do we really do here? You eat something enough times, you tend to get used to it and get bored. How do you get around that? Well, since the topic is retro dishes, we used to hear a lot about bacon bow tie crackers back in the day. It was something you could find for breakfast or a cocktail appetizer, which is some serious versatility. The crackers were extra crispy since they were wrapped inside bacon and then baked until the bacon itself was pretty crispy. It was the perfect combo, and all they needed was each other to realize that. It was smoky but sweet. It was also savory, but buttery smooth and not dry at all. Dishes that are such neat little combinations like these are often hiding right under your nose, and if we didn't have the imagination of so many home chefs who found these and got them into the public sphere, then we'd be a lot more tasteless as a country. Cabbage and bacon fry-up was something people adored for its simplicity and its affordability. It was a hearty meal you would frequently see on dinner tables throughout the 1960s if you weren't already tired of seeing it everywhere in cookbooks. It was very common to see this in Appalachia and the South, because cabbage was especially cheap there. Bacon was something the entire nation had a deep-found appreciation for, but the South was always one step ahead in all things savory. The dish was supposed to be a main course meal with a side. This would usually be cornbread or potatoes, but if you were working with lower quantities, then this dish could also do great as a side dish. Cabbage was one of the most affordable vegetables on the entire market, and it was not seasonal. Back then, refrigeration had not become a countrywide phenomena that everyone could rely on 24/7 like we do. We have our fridges on all the time, you know? And cabbage was one of those kinds of vegetables that could last for weeks and weeks without any kind of refrigeration. It was really quick and easy, it was flexible, and you could even try all kinds of different spices and toppings like ranch dressing to make it even better. You hear the name rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? Cabbage and noodle casserole was again a really typical dinner. It's a bit different from the vegetable and noodle casserole we went over because this one exclusively only deals with cabbages. One thing that made this dish really popular was the emphasis on community that people were placing. People with extended families had those relatives traveling all over the state and the country to come live with their in-laws or their sons and daughters. It only made sense to stick together and to take care of yours during all of this. Of course, that also did mean there were a lot more mouths to feed than before. Families solved these issues by relying on big batches of things like cabbage and noodle casserole. You would cook the noodles in a really large pot, and then you would prepare the cabbage. The way you do this is by dicing the cabbage into small bits and using leftover bacon and other meats as fillers. Keep layering that up until you have something resembling a casserole, and you're pretty much good to go. Plus, lots of neighborhoods would work together on dishes like this, and it would just help overall since everyone had their resources pooled together. For once, people didn't have shortages when things worked like that. The savory grilled cheese sandwich was the Depression-era comfort food that made even the simplest meal feel indulgent and like you were having a feast. With just bread and cheese, you could create a warm, melty sandwich that instantly lifted your spirits and comforted you during the hard times. The bread was cheap, and cheese was a luxury, but a little bit went a long way when you fried it up between two slices of bread. The secret to a perfect grilled cheese was in the toasting. You'd butter the bread or use whatever fat you had. Lard worked too, and fry it in a hot pan until golden brown and crispy. The cheese would melt inside, creating a gooey center that made this sandwich popular to this day, even though the ingredients were simple. If you were lucky, you could add extras like tomatoes or onions, but even on its own, a grilled cheese sandwich was a crowd pleaser. This meal was quick, easy, and, most importantly, cheap. It was perfect for lunch or dinner, and you didn't need much to make it satisfying. In tough times, a grilled cheese sandwich was a little slice of comfort, proving that even the most basic ingredients could come together to create something delicious. Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies, and this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Squash soup with garlic bread was honestly by far one of the best things you could make. I don't even mean this in a minimalistic survival sort of way. I mean, it was literally just good food that worked really well. Squash, like yellow squash or butternut squash, was the saving grace of so many families. Seriously, this thing was the people's champion. It had impressive PR for something that was so simple. People also didn't really have access to fresh food thanks to everything going on, but a decent-sized squash could go for anywhere between 5 to 10 cents. Now, the garlic bread was another thing entirely. People already were really familiar with the concept of growing their own things at home, and they had become pretty neat at making their own bread too. Where do we go from here? Well, you take those nifty little gardens I just explained, and you plant some garlic in them. Garlic bread was not only just really healthy, it worked awesome with squash. Like, nutritionally, you get me? Squash had so much vitamin A and C in it, and garlic naturally was an antioxidant, and with great winds came a lot of, well, toxidants. Minestrone soup was the ultimate Depression-era kitchen sink meal. Got some leftover veggies, a can of beans, and a bit of pasta? Throw it all in a pot and call it minestrone. This soup was a go-to for families looking to stretch their ingredients as far as they could. Carrots, celery, potatoes, or whatever you had on hand, everything went into the pot with some broth or water and simmered until the flavors melded together. To this day, minestrone soup is one of my favorites, and for good reasons. It sparks up a nostalgic feeling in my bones and brings up old memories. Each fall and winter in our house, it was known that for the next few months we will be eating only cold weather food, which meant minestrone soup, cabbage, stuffed bell peppers or zucchini, pumpkin-tasting anything. You get the gist. So every year, as the leaves start changing colors, I know it's time to get the warm clothes out and prepare our bellies for 6-ish months of warm, comforting foods. It's not said in vain that it is the most beautiful time of the year. Let me get back to the soup. It was a hearty, filling soup full of nutrients, and on top of that, super adaptable. The beauty of minestrone was that no two batches were ever quite the same, but they were always delicious. This soup was great for feeding a large number of hungry mouths on a budget, and it only got better as it sat in the fridge. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. The next best thing was definitely ham salad sandwiches. If you wanted a low-effort meal that would also make sure you were keeping muscle on, then there was arguably nothing better to go for than a ham salad sandwich. You might be thinking about the economics of all this because it does take a decent amount of ham to really make a salad. Not a lot, but hey, not a little bit either. So how does this really translate into it becoming an everyday staple for everyone? Well, the thing is that people would be frugal with the amount of ham they would put in there. They put enough bits to just make it a good sandwich, but not enough that the ham flavor would dominate the salad. Plus, this was a portable meal that you could have just about anywhere, which really made it stand out in terms of how convenient it was for people. Also, one of the best ways people would save costs on this meal was that they would use leftovers of ham and repurpose them into this salad. It was one of the best things to take along on family picnics too. So, making a lot of use out of the stuff you could grow easily was just the way people were living. You already know how convenient of a setup people had with cabbage, so the next stop was incorporating some awesome cabbage-based dishes into the weekly diet plan. Cabbage rolls stuffed with leftover rice were one of the best things to make because you could kill 3 birds with 1 stone. You were eating, for 1, and for 2, it was really healthy. Third of all, you would get to use any leftover rice and make sure absolutely nothing went to waste from your pantry. Sounds like someone being neurotic? Well, when the difference between being hungry is whether or not you manage a sack of rice properly, I think it's fairly justified. Now, I gotta say, people really weren't that open to cabbage yet. I mean, as a standalone item. They were used to having it as an embellishment in most dishes, but they didn't have anything that was cabbage-centric. The 1930s wasn't just a decade of struggle and resilience, it was also a decade of broadening horizons. People were acquiring tastes they never had thought they would ever enjoy. Moving on to something sweet for a second, rice pudding with raisins. It was a Depression-era answer to a comforting dessert made from almost nothing. Leftover rice, milk or water, some sugar, and a handful of raisins were all it took to make your kids happy with a sweet treat. The magic happened when the rice simmered down into a creamy, pudding-like consistency, turning something so plain into a dessert that felt a little indulgent. Raisins were the main show here. They added the perfect amount of taste and texture, making it taste fancy rather than ordinary. Just the thought of raisins makes me want to retch. I truly admire the strength our ancestors had when they were able to eat food like this. Don't get me wrong, I love rice pudding, but raisins? No way, not a chance. The best part about rice pudding is how flexible the recipe could be. If you were like me and didn't like raisins, you could just sprinkle some cinnamon on top, or maybe even a splash of vanilla if you were feeling fancy. For families looking to make a warm, sweet, and filling dessert, rice pudding with raisins was the perfect way to go. It satisfied almost every sweet tooth without costing much, making it a household favorite. Plus, it was really simple to make, so even the kids could help and stir the pot. Some of those kids are now our grandparents teaching us those same recipes. How beautiful is that? While speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did, though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. Macaroni and tomato soup bakes were an easy-to-handle casserole that was extremely hot in the working-class communities throughout the middle half of the 20th century. This was a dish that took elbow macaroni with canned tomato soup, and it was almost always Campbell's. A few more pantry staple ingredients would ensure an inexpensive and wonderful meal that maybe the kids would take a few rounds getting used to. For the adults, though, it was the best way to have comfort food on a budget besides potatoes. All you needed was cheese, milk, and eggs if they were available, but even without these, the dish could still be made. It just would not be as thick, rich, or as flavorful. The best part about this was that all you had to actually do was just boil the pasta and you would be set for the entire day. This could include bits of ground beef, bacon, or ham, whatever kind of protein is your choice really. But it could also be made creamy and with just aromatics and herbs. There was a lot of versatility with this bake, and that's because it was so simple. It made for a very flexible dish that could fit a lot of people's preferences easily, with almost none of the fuss you normally associate with homemade pasta dishes. This is so easy, even your teenagers could pick it up, really. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. Casseroles were definitely out of the question for most people. Yet a substitute that could fit into the picture was vegetable and noodle casseroles. Noodles were easy to make from scratch, and most people would even buy them in bulk because they hadn't suffered the worst of price hikes. That was reserved for things like good and common cuts of meat, which is part of why you'd never see your average, everyday casseroles on the table anymore. The best part of this dish was in 2 strengths that made it pretty much ideal for the Dust Bowl, though. Vegetable casseroles could be made with just about anything that people were growing in their victory gardens. Onions, olives, lettuces, and cabbages. If it's green and comes from the ground, you can put it in this casserole. Next, noodles were a filling thing to put in there too, because it kept your appetite down. Fiber, you know? Same reason gym bros are always telling you to eat oatmeal in the morning, it's like nature's Ozempic. The second strength this dish had was that it was really something you could make in bulk. I mean, once people got to making this, they could make it for more than just their family. Do you know how big of a deal that is? To actually have more than you need in a time like the 1930s? People saw the advantages to dishes like these and started making them for the entire community, often sharing ingredients and vegetables. It was actually pretty wholesome, if only it weren't in one of the worst times of the 20th century. Onion and potato frittata was an everyday favorite because they turned simple ingredients into a meal that felt special. Potatoes were cheap and filling, and onions added the extra flavor. The beauty of frittata was in its simplicity. You'd slice up some potatoes and onions, fry them until golden, and then pour beaten eggs over the top. Cook it until the eggs are set, and just like that you had a hearty, savory dish that worked for any meal. It was one of those dishes that could stretch to feed a crowd. Plus, if you had a little cheese lying around, you were going to become a favorite lunch host. It was an easy way to make a meal feel complete without having to use any expensive ingredients. This frittata was super versatile as well. You could throw in whatever veggies or leftovers you had on hand. Whether eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, onion and potato frittata was a reliable go-to that made the most out of limited supplies and left you feeling full and satisfied. It proved that a little creativity could vastly change the food game in the house. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. Potato and onion sandwiches are still something that I can see working today. They just feel a lot more closer to the realm of sanity than putting mayonnaise on bananas. Potatoes and onions together are a classic combination that has never failed anyone, and they weren't going to break that record in our country either. They became a hit in the Appalachian areas and the South, and there was an incredible need among the public for their regular fixing of potato and onion sandwiches. This was also one of the few meals you could have that would be entirely free. If you had the luxury of having your own land to grow plants and crops on, no matter how big or small, you definitely wanted to take advantage of potatoes and onions. They were very easy crops to grow, and having them meant a nice supply of food right out of your own home. If you didn't have room to grow anything, which is pretty understandable especially for office workers in big urban cities, you could always just buy one of these. It was so cheap it may as well have been free anyway. Chili beans and crushed crackers were just another meal from the never-ending nightmare that was the 1930s. But this one's just a bit more special than the rest. Maybe it's the one that got away in the entire history of food in the States. Maybe it's just how it became a staple of the culture later on, but this one always stood out. Chili beans and crackers were more than just a way to fill up for the evening. They were sometimes all you had. It wouldn't be so irregular to come back home from work, the most grueling shift of the week now safely behind you, and immediately be greeted by a bowl of chili beans and crushed crackers. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a time when people's wallets ran dry, it was also a time when their fields did too. It was very common for crops to fail, and families would often just live off of the tiny bits they could salvage. Basically, chili beans were the only recourse left to people in times like that. The last line of defense, you could say. It wasn't expensive, it filled you up, and it tasted just a bit more normal than everything else. You could say it was probably one of the few things people were eating that actually even had any taste anymore. You could get the entire thing in about 15 cents, and it would make you a lot happier. Guess that's why people look back on it with so much sentimentality. What do you think? Any comforting memories you can stir up and associate with a bowl of chili beans? Deviled eggs with pickles were a treat that turned humble ingredients into something delicious back in the day. Eggs were a cheap, reliable protein source, and if you had a jar of pickles, you were already halfway to creating something fancy, by 1930s standards anyway. Making deviled eggs is nothing revolutionary. Just hard-boil them, scoop out the yolk, and mix with a little mayo, mustard, and the thing that ties it all together: pickles. The pickles added a crunch that took the eggs from plain food to a party snack. However, the only party trick was surviving yet another day on a shoestring budget. People loved deviled eggs because they felt like a special treat, even when times were tough. The pickles added that little something extra, like a surprise flavor bomb in the middle of your egg. Plus, it was a great way to stretch a meal. Eggs were filling, and they were perfect for families who had to make do with limited supplies. Whether served at lunch or as a snack, deviled eggs with pickles were a fun, zesty way to make an ordinary ingredient feel a little more special. A name you might not hear very often in the cooking world, as far as French cuisine is concerned at least, is Marie-Antoine Carême, but you can thank her for some amazing dishes such as the vol au vent. This is actually something that got so popularized in American cookbooks in the mid-20th century. In the 1970s, when a national interest in foreign cooking really started popping off in America, there were a lot of trends centered around haute cuisine, and especially things you would find in premium French restaurants. In French-American communities, a vol au vent was a typical Saturday lunch that you would find being served up by your grandmother. Marie-Antoine Carême is a legendary French chef, and a reason she got that acclaim was because she managed to make up dishes that would suit the average household. Vol au vent is actually not really something you'd find at a five-star restaurant or on the upper end of what your wallet could afford. Most people would treat this like a party meal, something to serve at cocktail parties or New Year's ones. It was just puff pastry filled in with chicken, mushrooms, and creamy sauces, but it blended all of those together to make a really warm and earthy taste, which makes it perfectly suited to something you'd associate with your grandma's table. Homemade fish sticks were a really easy dish to make at home. They were really popular in blue-collar households and rural farmsteads that either couldn't afford the back and forth to big cities to get hauls of frozen food, or just ones who preferred to make their own stuff. Even if the transport wasn't an issue, frozen food would outright just be more expensive than people could accept sometimes, especially things like Gorton's or Van de Kamp's. Families didn't really just write the idea off entirely, though, because the concept of fish sticks being frozen for later use is pretty good. They adapted it into a homemade recipe instead, and this was especially true for all the towns near coastal areas like in the Great Lakes. They had access to all kinds of fresh local fish. But what about the people who had lived their whole lives in landlocked areas with no sight of water? Well, they used canned or frozen fish, and they used it more sparingly than others, but they would still resort to making their own fish sticks at home. Buying entire fillets and cutting them up was a lot more cost-effective than buying the prepackaged thing. Also, if you were a Catholic and meatless Fridays were really a thing back in your home, this was a great alternative. So, homemade macaroni with milk gravy. That was as fancy as you got during the Dust Bowl, and to be fair, it's a pretty good point to stop at. I mean, I still get really giddy when I come home to some macaroni, leftover or fresh. Now, there are some good benefits to macaroni as well. It's got a decent amount of carbohydrates and a lot of calories too, so you get a full meal out of it. The milk gravy, on the other hand, is really good for adding some flavor into your dish. We all know macaroni is a wonderful foundation for a good dish, but not a good thing to eat on its own. Gets real bland, no? Just not something that gives you an intense appetite. Add some milk gravy, on the other hand, and you actually end up with a pretty decent dish. Here's another spin for you. If you had leftover macaroni with milk gravy, you could even make a new dish out of it. Add in some fat drippings, herbs, vegetables, or whatever you have, and you end up with an entirely new flavor profile. Convenient, right? So where does macaroni rank on your comfort food list, if it has a place at all? And what do we think about milk gravy? Share all your thoughts down below. Depression-era mac and cheese was a budget-friendly comfort food that made you feel like you were living large on a dime. While today's mac and cheese might be full of fancy and expensive cheeses, back in the day, it was all about making the most out of basic ingredients. A boxed pasta, some milk, and only if you were lucky, some cheese. But you better pull that smile off your face. It wasn't the gooey, cheesy kind that we know of today. It was more of a humble, lightly cheesy dish that could fill you up, don't get me wrong. The trick was stretching those precious bits of cheese as far as humanly possible. People would thin it out with milk or even water. And if money was really, really tight, they would use flour to make a roux, a mixture of flour and fat that was used to thicken sauces. It definitely wasn't gourmet, but it was cheap, and the most important of all, it was food. Even with such limited sources, this dish managed to be a crowd pleaser, especially with kids, who were just excited to be eating pasta. Depression-era mac and cheese was a smart way to turn a few simple ingredients into a meal that seemed indulgent, even if it was light years away from today's extravaganza. But you have to admit, sometimes you don't want that fully spiced up mac and cheese. Sometimes you crave a simple canned version that won't make you regret eating it later. And that's exactly what Depression-era mac and cheese achieved. I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents' baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was, but what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Stuffed hot dog boats were something that were really popular among working-class families. This is because a lot of these meals so far are really practical and good for sustainable, everyday use, but they're a little lacking in the fun factor. Stuffed hot dog boats made up for this, though. They were kid-friendly, and they became something of a novelty meal with how much children ended up taking to them. They were also really popular in church cookbooks as a budget-friendly and creative dish. The idea behind a stuffed hot dog boat was that you would slice the dog right down the middle and then fill it with different kinds of toppings, kind of like a boat. These toppings would typically be baked beans, mashed potatoes, chili and cheese, or bacon bits. Anything on hand would work really, and people would experiment and play around with different kinds of fillings. Either way, it was a dish that was just fun to make, especially with your kids. It was also the kind of thing that was genuinely filling because of the way it was built. You could end up consuming more than your daily protein needs just off of one or two of these. So, turnip greens and cornmeal dumplings. These are actually even more affordable than the dumplings we went over previously. Dumplings that use flour were a little more unrealistic than ones that used cornmeal, after all. Turnip greens were also really inexpensive. You could get a bundle for around 15 cents, and that was something people could spare, especially on something like turnips, which were filled with health benefits. Not only that, you could spin this dish 100 different ways, so you'd almost never get bored of what you were eating either. You'd get a list of things essential to keeping the temple that is your body in good shape. Iron, calcium, vitamin K, carbs, fat, you name it, this dish probably has it. So you had a dish that was really filling while also being economical and healthy. This was pretty much the golden trio of traits that any plate of food needed to succeed with the masses. As far as the preparation process went, that's where this dish was just a bit lacking. You had to put in a lot of work to get this into a shape that was fit for eating. Now, it wasn't really necessary to use flour, but if you were, you'd get better dumplings. Most people didn't, though. They just really struggled with adding the right amount of the cornmeal mix into the turnip greens while they simmered in the broth. That little step decided what kind of flavor you'd end up with. Savory bread pudding with leftover veggies was the ultimate Depression-era hack for turning scraps into a hearty meal. Got stale bread? Perfect. Leftover veggies that are past their prime? Even better. This dish was all about not wasting a thing. People couldn't afford to throw food away during the Great Depression, but instead, they got creative. And this meal was one of those everything but the kitchen sink meals that you might have heard your grandma or great-grandma talking about. To make it, you had to tear up the stale bread, mix it with eggs and milk and whatever leftover vegetables you had lying around. It could be basically anything. Carrots, peas, whatever didn't make the cut for last night's dinner. Season it with salt and pepper and maybe some herb seasoning and bake until it is golden and crispy on top, but soft and warm inside. The best part about savory bread pudding was that it made something delicious out of things you would usually throw away. And the Great Depression didn't look kindly upon those who didn't know how to save up. Stale bread was transformed from slices into a cozy meal that tasted like it took more effort than it actually did. This dish proved that even in hard times, you could make a meal out of practically nothing. You hear the name rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? Potatoes weren't the only option. They were great, but not the only ones. On days when people would naturally get too tired of eating potatoes, they would always go for things like baked bean sandwiches. This was a filling, no-fuss meal that was especially loved by working-class homes that were doing labor-intensive work. They were very common in the Northeast, the Midwest, and different parts of the South, especially where any kind of construction was going on. It was also really helpful that so many brands had come out with such accessible and easy canned beans. These were cheap, required no effort to cook, and the result was something you could use in a soup, a sandwich, or a casserole. It just depended on what you were feeling that day. Either way, you were going to get a delicious meal. One of the biggest reasons I think this was as popular as it was is because people really began to rely on it during the Great Depression. Another good reason is that this was the perfect lunch for your kids, and it was so low effort that making it wasn't a hassle at all. So people had some different ways of incorporating split pea soup and bread into their diets during the Depression. One of the most common ways to do it was to have the split pea soup just be a one-pot meal. Why did this work? Well, to save you a long story detailing why cooking it in one pot works, it was most usually prepared that way. Plus, the broth it would simmer in would work really well as a side. Season that with just some basic things like salt and pepper, and you have yourself a pretty full meal. The next thing to do was to crumble the bread into the soup and then pretty much just use it to thicken the soup. Sometimes people did this because otherwise the soup in question was just a little too runny and thin. How could it be anything else? You might be thinking of the typical, conventional soups we're used to, but this was literally just beans and water. Then still, there were people who used the bread as a topping, and they'd dip pieces of the bread, scoop up the peas, and make a bite out of it. It was switching things up in little ways like this that helped people keep their sanity intact through the back-to-back madness that was the 1930s. Fried corn fritters were a Depression-era favorite because they made something out of almost nothing. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and very versatile, so in times when money was tight, corn fritters were everyone's go-to. All you needed was a little cornmeal, flour, water, or milk, and an egg if you could afford one. Mix it all up, fry it in some oil, and lunch is served. These fritters were the perfect way to turn pastry staples into something delicious. They were crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and packed with flavor. And because cornmeal was so affordable, you could whip up a batch without thinking about how much money it cost. You could even throw in whatever you had in the house to stretch it even more and add nutritional value. Any leftover veggies or cheese added more flavor to the meal, making it even more comforting. Corn fritters were the kind of meal that made you feel resourceful and proved that even in hard times, you could take a handful of basic ingredients and make them into something delicious. We're going to take a bit of a deep dive into a cuisine that we haven't really explored before. I'm talking about caponata, which is a very traditional Sicilian dish that goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's supposed to be a sailor's dish. Can you believe that? It got that reputation attached to it because the birthplace of caponata was Sicily. There's no specific restaurant or name that's credited with making it, but if you ever went there, you'd know just how much the people appreciate this. The first time this became popular in America was when Mediterranean cuisine and Italian immigrants were mixing together and creating all sorts of new dishes, as well as bringing old familiar ones from their homeland. The best part about this dish for a lot of people was that it gave a chance to a vegetable, which otherwise people just aren't too fond of. I mean, eggplants aren't really the most main course worthy idea you could think of, right? Pair that up with some tomatoes, onions, olives, and capers and cook it in vinegar, sugar, and olive oil. Make a nice little traditional agrodolce sauce, and you'll get this extremely earthy dish with a lot of complex flavors going for it. Canned salmon patties were also known as salmon croquettes, and they had a few different reasons for being as beloved as they were. So, first of all, everyone just loves salmon. It's a fact of life, but salmon is one of the most popular kinds of fish to ever grace the waters and tables of the United States. Now, canned salmon takes that up a notch by being incredibly affordable, having a very long shelf, and not needing any refrigeration. Besides just being one of the most easy-to-use ingredients across the board and having a justified place in almost every kind of recipe that we see today, salmon patties did eventually go out of relevancy. I think people just moved on from the idea of having salmon in the shape of a patty instead of some saucy dish that really capitalizes on that. I like the intrigue of a good fish sandwich myself, but there's just more fun to be had. Luckily, people would use the patties in different ways at least. While some people would just eat the straight up, others would make rice bowls out of them or sandwiches and burgers. It was actually a pretty decent idea for how low effort it was. So the techniques that people picked up with dumplings helped them out in other areas too. Namely, making homemade bread. You'd pair that up with lard spread and onion slices, and you'd pretty much be eating as good as someone could be during the bowl and the Depression. What a time though, at least in retrospect. You have one of the worst economic crashes in documented history paired with Mother Nature having an equally historical fit. It's really no wonder that circumstances like that awoke the baker and home chef in a lot of people, probably just out of practicality. Anyway, back to homemade bread. So for this, all you'd need is flour. Most people were using all-purpose flour since it was cheaper to work with. Water, yeast, and salt were the rest of the gang. If you couldn't get your hands on some yeast, sourdough starter would work well too. Honestly, one of the hardest things to get was just the sugar needed for the brain, since granulated sugar was getting pretty hard to come by. Next, the lard spread. So during this time, people really started adopting the mentality of not wasting anything, not even a single part of the animal. That definitely meant all the lard too, which people would hold on to exactly for days like this. On its own, it doesn't exactly inspire an appetite though, but with some onion slices, you've had worse. Fried rice with vegetables was the ultimate Depression-era hack for making leftovers exciting again. Day-old rice was the perfect base because it was cheap, filling, and easy to stretch. And just like with rice pudding with raisins, rice came to steal the show. You'd take whatever vegetables were on hand, carrots, peas, onions, or anything nearing its expiration date, toss them in a hot pan with a bit of oil, and fry it all together until golden and fragrant. Nothing, and I mean nothing, goes to waste. This dish was about making the most of what you had. It didn't matter if the veggies were a little past their prime because once they hit the pan, they were given a new life. A little soy sauce or garlic added a ton of flavor, and if you were lucky enough to have an egg, you could crack one in for extra protein. The fried rice was a genius way to turn scraps into something satisfying. It was fast, flavorful, and filling, everything you needed in a meal when times were tough. Plus, it was incredibly versatile. You could throw in any leftover meat or keep it vegetarian, and it would still be a hearty dish that stretched the food budget. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. Now, as for egg and breadcrumb patties, these were really nice protein-packed meals that were also a wonderful way to make sure your family and household wasn't wasting any kind of bread. They were particularly popular in all kinds of farming families, and they were a pillar of Great Depression-era cooking. Stretching ingredients was really essential in these times, and it was pretty much how people lived for ages. This dish was a meat substitute that was great for coal mining towns and towns where industrial, labor-intensive jobs were more common. This is because it was such a good source of protein and energy while also filling you up. It made those really long work hours in the sun or in a mine a bit easier to get through, though let's be real, nothing was helping too much with that. The seasonings were very bare minimum though. Salt, pepper, onions, mustard, garlic were your typical picks. I know that sounds like a lot, but people would just pick different combinations of these and see what worked best for their pasties. The crunch and crisp on that first bite from the breadcrumbs, though, that was a work of art. So, if corn was sitting pretty at number 1 in terms of what was easy to get, what would you say number 2 was? Well, historians would pretty much agree with potatoes being the popular choice. Particularly, having potatoes with onion soup and bread was another way for people to tick off 3 things from their daily routines: nutrition, a full meal, and enough food to go around the entire table. Potatoes were pretty much just 5 cents per pound, and this was right around the earliest years. The reason you wanted to keep a massive stock of these bad boys was because they were built for survival situations. They last like literally forever. I mean, I think I've had a few potatoes that have been around since the Prohibition. Secondly, their other name is versatility. Fry it, boil it, steam it, mash it, or dice it. Whatever way you repurpose a potato, you'll get a damned good meal out of it. Plus, the fact that they're full of carbs makes them one of the best things to eat during a drought because it keeps your appetite low. Bread and onions were pretty much priced around the same price point, and that meant that people were able to make a good soup out of the 3 pretty easily. Now let's be real. People were definitely lowballing their standards just to be able to enjoy the meal, especially after like the 56th time they had it, but it was still a lot easier to swallow than other alternatives. Tomato soup with rice was a Depression-era lunch that combined simplicity with a great deal of comfort. You didn't need much in order to make it. Just a can of tomatoes, or even water and tomato paste, a handful of rice, and any seasoning you like. This was the perfect meal for a cold, rainy day when you needed something warm and filling that could stretch your ingredients and make them last a week. Rice was the main deal here. It could bulk up the soup, turning a thin tomato broth into a hearty meal. With rice, you can always assume that a little goes a long way, and it turned what could have been a sad bowl of red water into a meal that actually felt like food. Plus, rice was very cheap, so adding that to your meals meant you made sure that a small pot of soup could feed the whole family. And while it wasn't really gourmet, you could get your creative freak on and make it special. A few tricks included adding a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity, and a pinch of garlic powder to make it zesty. Tomato soup with rice was the kind of meal that will get you through hard times, without making you feel like you were missing out on some great delicacy. It was simple, satisfying, and budget-friendly. Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. Cornish pasty was a portable meal that was an essential food for one specific group of people: miners. In Michigan, Pennsylvania, Montana, and other popular mining regions in the United States, this was the meal to have every day. It came from Cornwall, England, and it was this handheld meat and potato pie that became so beloved by coal, copper, and iron ore miners. These miners would always be working in dirty, dark, damp, and dangerous caverns, and they had no way to really ever wash their hands in the middle of work. It's not like people were going to be investing in or carrying bottles of sanitizer. The pasties, though, weren't going to be a problem in this regard. You could hold them up by the crust and just eat the filling. Of course, this meant that miners would have to throw away the crust, but you were still eating the majority of the meal. This was also durable, and it could stay warm for hours and hours, which made it ideal for miners. Despite what you might think, some of those mines really get low temperature-wise. It was also something that Cornish miners brought into the country when they eventually immigrated. They had settled in American mining towns in the 1800s, And these pasties have been a tradition in America as well ever since. While I know for a fact you've definitely had some unappetizing meals, let's talk about some good rub. Sweet potato and corn chowder was one of the best things you could get for yourself. See, again, this was a lot like chili beans and crushed crackers. It was sustenance, it was filling, it was a friend to fall back on during hard times, but it was warm. No, I don't mean that it had a decently high temperature. I mean the kind of warmth you feel after having a good hangout with your friends, or a really good meal your mother cooked. Emotional comfort, joy, all that good stuff. Sweet potato and corn chowder was a soup that felt like a soup, and it was also something that really made you healthy as you regularly ate more of it. Plus, people began to grow sentimental attachments to their crops. You have to understand that these were not people who had been raised in the way of farming. Their hands had no calluses, and their eyes couldn't tell how deep you needed to plant a crop. They had a lot of trial and error before they could reliably start growing things like sweet potatoes and corn, and once they did, it tasted even better because they knew it was a result of their hard work. So going to work with a bag full of lunch and a heart full of dreams is the best start to any morning. What is truly heartbreaking, though, is some incredible lunches that have been lost to time. Let's look into them once again. To start it off, we're going to keep it very healthy with egg salad stuffed tomatoes. This was supposed to be a really light twist on the usual egg salad, which, as far as salads went, performed really well. Now, tomatoes aren't exactly someone's first pick when it comes to eating healthy and making your food taste good. Do they work on things like pizzas and burgers? Of course, but they're always usually a background character, even in those types of dishes. Here, though, the tomato is supposed to be the star of the show. The thing is, you're eating a tomato that's been hollowed out completely and has been stuffed with egg salad. You ever seen those jalapenos that have been emptied out and stuffed with cheese or aromatics? It's kind of like that. Why did something like this ever go out of style? Well, in today's culture of waking up half an hour before your shift because you need every bit of sleep you can possibly imagine, it just doesn't make sense to have something that's so prep work heavy as your daily lunch. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies. And this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Egg salad and olive sandwiches were also one of the best combinations people had when times were tough. Around the end of the month, when your pay would be finishing up and you were stretching the last of your groceries, it was very common for people to make this for breakfast. It was really easy to elevate a simple sandwich into something more delicious thanks to this combination, and it got very popular in church fundraiser cookbooks. You would also see this on school cafeteria menus, and it was a really popular choice for picnics and potlucks too. For a humble sandwich that's just egg salad and olives, it definitely got around. This sandwich worked amazingly well as a packable lunch you could take with you or as a quick little family meal. Eggs were still not too expensive for most people, so working-class families relied on them as much as they could. 1 or 2 eggs was enough for the dish if you were being modest, and if you had some sauces to throw on top, then that would be even better. In pretty much exactly the same vein, you had brown bread and baked beans. Look, no matter how bad things get, you really can't change human nature. People need to switch things up, or before starvation and poverty take them, boredom and monotony will. One of the best ways to keep things fresh in the household was to just switch out the potatoes and onions for some baked beans. You had your typical beans, the same ones people were eating with cornbread, but they'd just be baked instead. This would give them a warm, toasty feeling, and you can definitely already guess how that came in clutch during wintertime. Oh yeah, winters during the Dust Bowl were a vivid scene out of hell. Those winds were sharp and cold enough to split your bones, but holding on to some sense of comfort thanks to your bowl of baked beans and bread was a little joy that pushed people far enough into the new year and eventually the next season. So this is a bit of a tricky name to pronounce even when you give it a genuine try, but it's worth knowing about this dish because of how good it is. Ballymaloe Irish lamb stew is something that comes all the way from County Cork, and lamb stew is something that Americans welcome with very open arms. You can particularly find this dish being spread in droves around St. Patrick's Day in any Irish-American community. Whether you're in New Hampshire or Rhode Island, which even today have a pretty solid amount of Irishmen living in them, you're bound to run into a Ballymaloe stew once in a while. Despite how good of a stew it is, with tender carrots, potatoes, and tender strips of lamb, and how simple the preparation is since it relies mostly on the natural flavors present in the ingredients, this dish actually flopped once before. Well, I wouldn't say it was a true flop, but it did fade out of the memory of the general public before too. That was before the 20th century, but ever since then it has been seeing a bit of a revival thanks to social media and Ballymaloe House, which is what it's named after. Either way, this is one of the best recipes to ever come out of a family cookbook. And if you've ever had one while at an Irish friend's home, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Creamed peas on toast were a very simple and inexpensive meal that helped many people get through the day in the 1960s, especially throughout rural America. Peas were man's best friend because of how abundant they were. You could also throw them on top of anything for a better crunch and flavor, or you could just make breakfast meals out of them like this. The 1960s were seen as a transitional period for the culinary world in America. Processed convenience foods were slowly starting to dominate, but working-class homes were going to feel the change later than others. They were still relying on home-cooked meals that had been passed down from family to family. That's pretty much how it would work in a lot of rural areas. People would find out a great idea, record it, pass it down to their kids. Sometimes that would be ways to farm or maintain the home, and other times it would be how to have a breakfast that saves you money. A can of peas cost just a few cents, and it did the job better than anything else if you didn't have beans on hand, so why not? I mean, it's a lot better than just toast. One thing that helped a lot throughout arguably all of the Dust Bowl was the simple luxury known as cornbread. Cornbread was made entirely out of cornmeal, and that was one of the things that was still abundant throughout America. Here, you can run out of walkers in busy hospitals, but never corn. Funny how that one works, right? Anyway, the Dust Bowl was something that almost entirely hit rural areas throughout the Great Plains. You had places like Kansas, Kentucky, Colorado, Orlando, Texas, and so many more areas hit badly by the horrible circumstances that led to the bowl. How was your average schmuck supposed to stay happy and keep his family fed? Well, cornbread and beans were the peasant folks' answer to nature throwing a temper tantrum. Now, it was obvious that the only way they were going to be helped was if they did it themselves, so lots of people began trying to cultivate crops of corn. Beans, particularly pinto and navy beans, were still relatively affordable, even in the face of the Depression. Seriously, I can't talk about how horrible that entire decade was for America. It was like a series of unfortunate events, each even worse for the economy than the last. People held on to things like cornbread and beans like they were pearls. Spaghetti with garlic and olive oil was a Depression-era meal that proved you could make something delicious from only 3 ingredients: spaghetti, garlic, and olive oil. You could whip up a dish that felt fancy without emptying your wallet. This was the kind of meal that made you look like you knew what you were doing in the kitchen, even when you were just throwing stuff together. Boil the spaghetti, then toss it in a pan with sizzling garlic and olive oil, and in a matter of seconds, your home smelled like an Italian restaurant. Sure, you didn't have any meat or sauce, but who needs them when you have garlic to do all the heavy lifting? Olive oil gave the pasta a nice, silky coat, while the garlic brought the savory punch that made you forget how simple the dish actually was. If you had the means, you would sprinkle some Parmesan or red pepper flakes on top, but even without these extras, the pasta hit the spot. This dish was a Depression-era go-to because it was cheap, easy, and quick to make. And sometimes, less is more. The next thing we have on the list is Hoppin' John's soup, which is right out of the classics of soul food in the southern parts of America and all over, really. I say the South because that's where people most commonly associate its origins with. However, the Hoppin' John dish itself was something that was a result of all the Africans that were brought over as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. This dish typically involves black-eyed peas and African rice, but in soup form, it works just as well with mushrooms, basic vegetables like bell peppers, and spices. This is one of the best soups you could find yourself making in the winter, especially if you live in areas where the temperature really drops to bone-chilling levels. It's so hearty and warm that the dish just screams pure comfort in every way and form. It was a really popular appetizer on a lot of restaurant menus, and it was amazing as a lunch too, but this is a textbook example of an old head recipe. You wouldn't remember it, and your parents probably don't either if they're a little on the young side, but I'm sure anyone's grandparents would remember having this, or at least hearing about it in the days when it was still one of the trendiest soups around. Liverwurst and mustard sandwiches were another working-class lunch that was actually really good back in the 60s. Liverwurst isn't really something we hear a lot about today, but it was still a lot better than cold cuts like ham or any kind of beef back then, really. Plus, liverwurst is known for having a very smooth texture. It's kind of like ground beef, and it's also not bad for you at all. I mean, besides the really nice protein gains, it's just super convenient to cook. It doesn't need any kind of reheating, it barely needs prep work, and the sandwiches work with anything at all. The most common pairings for this was just adding a little bit of liverwurst to rye bread with mustard and chowing away. I think the people that brought this as a lunch the most were probably blue-collar workers. It was definitely one of those go-to office lunch meals people would pack and bring. You'd especially see this in the Pennsylvania, New York areas where it was pretty much guaranteed that at least one person in the office would be having this. Also, liverwurst had an awfully mushy texture to it, which made people really want to enjoy it with bread. Something about how those textures melt in your mouth together and make this harmonious bite. So, you might be surprised to hear this one, but people actually got enough turnip stew and dumplings to make a meal out of it. You might be thinking dumplings sound pretty expensive for a time when the wins themselves were stacked against your bank account, but hear me out. Dumplings were actually insanely economical, and loads of Americans had begun to make real efforts to learn how to make some good ones. Dumplings used flour, water, fat, and some baking powder. All of this basically costs around 5 to 10 cents individually, minus the fat and water. Since people usually wouldn't have fat to work with, they'd use lard. People were making dumplings at home and mixing them up with stews, broths, and just about everything else they worked with. Now, turnips, on the other hand, those were the actual tricky things to get. It's exactly because they were easy to cultivate and one of the few things that actually worked with the climate of the Great Plains that people were so quick to ravage the stores for them. As a side effect of that, most people simply resorted to growing them in their gardens, because at least you'd know for a fact you'd wake up to some turnips. Sweet potato bisque was a Depression-era dish that made something rich, special, and comforting out of the simplest ingredients. Sweet potatoes were cheap, filling, and packed with nutrients, making them a staple. To make this bisque, you'd boil the sweet potatoes, mash them up, and blend them with water or milk to create a smooth, creamy soup. Add a bit of salt, pepper, and maybe a sprinkle of cinnamon, and you had yourself a bowl of warmth and comfort. What made sweet potato bisque so great was how satisfying it was for so little cost. The natural sweetness of the potatoes gave it a rich flavor without the need for expensive ingredients, and its creamy texture made it feel indulgent. Whether eaten on its own or with a slice of bread, this bisque was the perfect way to fill up during tough times. It was a simple, hearty dish that provided warmth, nutrition, and comfort. It is popular to this day and considered somewhat of a luxury. It is widely used in high-end restaurants, whether it is served as a side dish or as a full-course meal. And by that I mean, it is served on those big plates with just a sprinkle of food in the middle, which costs more than my shoes. But never mind that, it was and is, to this day, a fall staple. Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like Apple Betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Spam and fried potato hash is a really nice, filling, and easy-to-make meal that actually fits perfectly well into the diet of working-class families. It's something you would most commonly see in farmsteads, military families, and overall just everywhere across the South. I think wherever the idea of canned meat was something pivotal to people's everyday diets, this was a recipe that did numbers. It was really high in protein, fat, and calories, which meant that it was pretty much the perfect thing to have every day if you were a laborer. Spam had been something that was gaining more and more of a reputation thanks to its work in the war. It became a staple military ration during World War II. And as for potato hash, well, who would ever turn down a plate of that? So for just a few cents and the inconvenience of waiting for your potatoes to boil, this was a full-on meal that would leave you feeling very full and energized. You already know what the deal is with potatoes. Besides just that, though, you might be surprised to know people really cozied up to cabbage. It only makes sense for cabbage and potato stew to be such a popular combination then. Why did this happen? How did it happen? Well, they just had chemistry, for lack of a better word. Cabbages were just as easy to grow as potatoes were, and they cost around the exact same, namely just 5 to 10 cents. You gotta understand one thing about living in times like this too. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, was eating for pleasure. People had two approaches to food during the entire Dust Bowl era. One was that you had to eat things that were filling because it would save costs. The other was that you had to eat things that would keep you healthy and free of sickness because it would save costs. By now, I think the entire national poverty aspect of all of this might really start to sink in. Either way, cabbage and potato stew was adept at satisfying both of those needs, so it only made sense that people made it such a regular meal at their tables. To finish off with a warm hug, let's talk about potato leek soup. This soup turned humble ingredients into a creamy, comforting dish. Leeks added an oniony taste to the dish, which nicely complemented the mild taste of potatoes. You'd sauté the leeks, add chopped potatoes, and simmer them in water or broth until soft. Then, mash or blend the mixture for a creamy, rich soup without the need for cream. It was perfect for cold days when you just scream for something to warm you up. It was also a great way to use up any leeks or potatoes you had on hand, and like most Depression-era recipes, it was adaptable. You don't have leeks? Use onions. No broth for the soup? You do have water, right? There wasn't a single excuse you could have for not making this delicious meal. Potato leek soup was a comforting dish that made you feel like you were indulging, even if the ingredients were modest. Did you find any familiar meals from your childhood on this list? If you did, comment it down below, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. So the next two dishes we have on the list are actually some classics right out of Africa and its many varied cuisines. First off, we have chicken and collard greens pilau, which is just the perfect dish to have if you're aching for something that involves a lot of rice in it. The steamed and boiled chicken mixed with the pilau as a base for the dish gives it an aroma that's pretty much unbeatable. Back in the middle of the 20th century, if you really wanted to experiment with some foreign cooking and tastes, then you would go into African American communities and try out the best of their soul food. You'd have to look around a little for the really nice restaurants, especially if you were in places like the southern parts of America, but nonetheless, people found a way. Pilau itself is also a dish that's extremely common in the subcontinent for many reasons. People use basmati rice for this, which is a little different from the rice you guys might be used to, but if you give it a shot, you might find that it has a more full flavor all around. Also, don't even get me started on how good this is for you. If you're a gym bro looking for a great way to add some tasty protein and carbs to your diet, then chicken and collard greens with some pilau is a pretty flawless place to start. Navy bean loaves are pretty much exactly what you think they are. Want the comfort of a baked loaf along with all the benefits and muscle building of 3 different kinds of beans? You've found the right recipe. This loaf was a budget-friendly, meatless meal that became popular among the working class and people who were trying to cut down on how much meat they were eating. Growing health concerns really made people turn to dishes like this more and more often because they were realizing that they couldn't afford, financially, physically, or mentally, several health scares per year just because of higher cholesterol or something. Bean loaves were something that were synonymous with being a clean, healthy dish. They were also very filling, and they would go around a family of 4 pretty easily. Beans were a great source of fiber, not just protein, so they also made you full for longer. You could literally just mash and blend them into a thick paste. You could also leave a few chunks in there for a better bite, and then you would just need breadcrumbs and crackers to bind everything together. Pour in some eggs for a better shape, and throw it in the oven. Beet and potato hash was yet another comfort food that was really popular during this entire fiasco. So, beets were something that people grew in their backyard victory gardens, and potatoes, well, you're already pretty well acquainted with their status during all of this. I just realized, despite going on and on about victory gardens, I haven't explained what they are yet. Basically, people began to make use of any soil, fertile ground, or just any spot they had in their backyards that could grow something. This was how people traded with each other and how they lived because it was food you were growing, so it was free, it was healthy, and you got access to a wide variety of crops. The downside was the waiting game, and it was a pretty lengthy one when it came to beets. They were cheap enough to get at local markets though, so people always had that as a secondary option too. Potatoes, on the other hand, were something people exclusively grew because it was extremely hard to find them in stores. People just emptied those shelves way too fast. You'd mix some bacon fat in, around 2 tablespoons, and then just an onion and salt and pepper. A skillet would work, and then you'd have yourself a warm plate of hash. So you might notice that this issue where you need a lot of prep work for these dishes isn't exactly a unique one. Lots of dishes share it, and even cottage cheese and pineapple bowls have the same problem. Now, this dish was something that came out around the 60s and 70s, when Americans were really into trying out new things. One of the first things they opted for was pineapple, and this was thanks to Spam, which really made the American population warm up to an otherwise chronically detested fruit. This bowl was seen as healthy, full of protein, it was cold, and it could be prepared way ahead of time. The reason this lasted as long as it did was probably because of that, though only people that were super serious about their health and diet would be bringing this kind of stuff to the office. It wouldn't make sense to ignore the perfectly convenient, cheap, and delicious deli food on the corner of your office and go for a cottage cheese and pineapple bowl. Unfortunately, while this one has the convenience factor down, it couldn't last in the long haul because tastes have just changed too much from the days where bowls like this could work. If you take a look at the history of Brooklyn, you'll find something that was really popular, which was ham cheese balls. These were the perfect bite-sized appetizer to gorge yourself on while you waited for the main meal. A lot of grandmas would have handwritten notes tacked onto family cookbooks about how to make the perfect ham ball, what the ratio of meat was, how much cheese you needed to put in, how much you needed to roll them and shape them before they were perfect. It was one of those snacks that just did well everywhere. In Iowa, too, it was one of the most easily available snacks you could find anywhere in the state. All in all, it's one of the best things to ever come out of the Midwest. And no Christmas is honestly complete until you down a platter of ham cheese balls and make the tray look spotless. Have you ever grown up around these? Do you still remember the taste? It's not something you would find so often nowadays, but the days when it was really everywhere were some good ones. Hot dog and potato casseroles were literally the best thing you could get for yourself in the 1960s. If you wanted to be full, feed your entire family, make it somewhat healthy and decently tasty, and ensure it was something that the kids would eat too. That might be a pretty tall order, especially on a budget. But if you were having hot dog and potato casseroles, this is exactly the kind of experience you were getting. It was such a comfortable dish, the kind that really puts you to sleep afterwards and leaves you not wanting to get out of bed at all. Hot dogs were always a favorite among every age range, and the energy from the potato casserole plus the protein from the bits and pieces scattered and baked into the casserole made this dish stand out. While being absolutely delicious, affordable, and easy to make, hot dog and potato casseroles were also amazing for you. It was a part of the entire casserole craze that ended up consuming the 1960s. But how can you blame them? What really beats a good casserole? Carrot soup with some amazing, homely crackers made right in the comfort of your kitchen was the ideal breakfast and lunch going around during the dusty apocalypse that plagued the land. It was cheap, it was fresh, and the carrots were super good for you. Carrots were grown a lot in Victory Gardens, and they were a staple, really. Most people dedicated their cellars to holding carrots because of their ability to last for so many months without any kind of cooling. Didn't have access to refrigeration? It's time to open up that basement, buddy. One other thing that really helped carrots take center stage as one of the most commonly consumed vegetables across the United States. Canned food being introduced during this time was really a generational switch-up from the norms people were used to. Canned carrots were expensive, just a bit more, and it wasn't as convenient as growing them in your own garden, but it was still something. I mean, you could get 0-15s. If you got really lucky during the Depression, you could even put in some meat drippings. Carrots gave a lot of vitamin A too, which a lot of people thought was really necessary back then. Remember what I said about keeping yourself healthy because it avoided doctor's trips? Yeah, that. Simple egg drop soup was a staple because it took next to nothing to make, but still felt like a real meal. What you needed was some broth, homemade or from whatever scraps you could find, and a few eggs. You'd bring a broth to a simmer, whisk the eggs in a bowl, and slowly and carefully drizzle them in a hot liquid while stirring. The eggs would instantly cook, turning into soft, silky ribbons that made the soup what it is to this day. If you've got leftover veggies, be prepared to make this soup, and if you've got meat, even better. You've just made yourself a delicacy. Egg drop soup was a meal that stretched what little you had left while still managing to be comforting and filling. Even if you were running low on ingredients, egg drop soup made you feel like you were eating something homemade and special, instead of scraps you could barely gather. It could warm you up, fill you up, and the best thing of all, it took you, maybe and only maybe, about 5 minutes to make. This one is an oddball. Banana and mayonnaise sandwiches were apparently all the rage back then. It was really surprising how common they had become, because usually you would give something like this a bad look and keep moving on with your day, waiting for, the chance to get an actual meal. It's definitely something no one could imagine eating in today's world. This sweet and savory combination actually had die-hard fans, though. Whether it was the fact that this was a convenient sandwich you could throw together in seconds, or how filling and high-calorie it was, people loved it. I mean, being honest with you, I've seen some pretty bizarre banana combinations over the course of preparing this video, but this one definitely stuck in my memory for a little bit. But hey, who can argue with health? And as far as that was concerned, this was a jackpot. Bananas were a natural source of energy and sugar, and mayonnaise was something that really made the dish more filling. This was also particularly popular in the South, and I know you're thinking that's really out of place, and I'd be inclined to agree with you, but the South has definitely been an experimentative place with its food. You could even get this at diners for the right price. Got a blocked nose? Not really feeling up to whatever you have to do today? Or are you just plain down? Maybe you need to give that metabolism a kick. Meals like stuffed bell peppers, especially with barley and vegetables, were some of the best things you could get. Stuffed bell peppers were some of the best ways people could keep their moods up during the Dust Bowl and Depression. You might be wondering what all those questions have to do with what we're discussing right now. Well, don't you think allergies spread like wildfire when the winds are carrying all kinds of filthy dust across the country? What about your daily tasks? Think you can manage them on such an empty stomach? Poverty really keeps a person down too, and poor nutrition messes badly with your body's functions, especially metabolism. See, tiny, progressively worse health issues like that were so common, and it just wasn't possible for people to go to the doctor for them. Peppers, on the other hand, not only release chemicals that naturally make you feel better, they also warm up your body temperature, help with basic symptoms of allergies, and give your metabolism a much-needed kick. They were also wildly inexpensive, and in fact, a lot of people got a good green thumb and eventually started growing them in their gardens. You add barley and vegetables to that, and you're pretty much eating as healthy as a person can be during the Depression. My personal favorite from this list, mashed potato patties. They were a genius way to use up leftover potatoes while creating a tasty treat. Potatoes going to waste during the Great Depression? Now that's just vile. It was like the 8 deadly sins. If you had leftover mashed potatoes, you'd mix them with a little flour, maybe an egg if you had one, and season them up with salt and pepper. Form them into patties, fry them up in a pan until they are crispy, and suddenly those leftovers were a star of the meal. Their crispy outside and soft inside made them everyone's favorite, even though they were made from the simplest ingredients. You could eat them on their own if you had some gravy or maybe even some vegetables. Now that's a whole meal if you ask me. Mashed potato patties were a hit because they were so easy to make and could feed the whole family with minimal effort. Who doesn't like fried potatoes? I know a person that doesn't. My mother. Nothing fried will ever step foot in her kitchen. So there weren't any potato patties for us. Actually, that's not true. They were just oven-baked. I guess they weren't so bad. I am just bitter that they weren't fired. Fried potato patties were crunchy, satisfying, and a great way to give new life to everyone's favorite pantry staple, potatoes. Cucumber and onion sandwiches were a really simple and refreshing butter, mayonnaise, different kinds of spices, and sometimes bits of bacon and ham on top of cucumbers. See, now I don't know if you guys will agree with me, but cucumbers really have a good place in the world of sandwiches and burgers. They're one of the most light toppings you can add, they're abundant, they're good for you, that crunchy bite is immaculate, and they work well with most kinds of sauces. It's a really straightforward dish that can work with almost anything you happen to have on hand. And on a hot summer day, this was the perfect meal to eat for your work lunch. It was served as an interlude between the usual fried, oily, and greasy food most Americans were used to anyway. Onions were something that everyone always had, and this could work with fresh or stale bread. They were beloved mostly for their detoxifying effects and how refreshing a cucumber can be. Textile workers and coal miners in particular loved these because it would take the edge off. Another use of bread that was honestly way past its expiry date was savory bread pudding with onions and herbs. People would use this bread to add some kind of carbs to their meal. Plus, it also helped them stay full longer, so there was always that. You could easily grow the onions, and caramelizing them, regardless of the era or the ongoing crisis, was never really much effort for anyone. So you'd end the day with some bread pudding and whatever spices, herbs, and vegetables you had, you'd throw in there so you would just get a smidgen of flavor. This was definitely something that was more common in urban areas though, because it really needed an oven. That meant that people who were living in rural areas were pretty much barred from ever having this dish. It wasn't something you could make over an open fire, but it was definitely good for families. You could even serve beans on the side. People in rural areas tried to mimic it with porridge made out of bread, but that was never really the same. Carrot and potato hash was a Depression-era staple that made the most out of two cheap and hearty veggies. Potatoes were filling while carrots added just enough sweetness to keep things interesting. This meal was perfect for stretching a limited budget because both ingredients were as cheap as they come, lasted forever, and could be found in almost every kitchen. The preparation was simple. Chop up the vegetables, toss them in a hot pan, and fry until golden and crispy. It was simple, but the combination of soft potatoes and slightly caramelized carrots created a comforting, flavorful dish. If you had an onion lying around, it could join the party, adding even more depth to this humble hash. The beauty of carrot and potato hash is in its versatility. You could eat it on its own or throw an egg on top for some protein. Either way, it was filling, warm, and super satisfying. Everything you needed to keep going during tough times. It wasn't the most exciting dish, but it got the job done. And isn't that what really counts? Corn fritters with syrup were some of the best eating you could get during the Dust Bowl. It was one of the things that really started the entire tradition of corn and syrups being so popular, especially around winter and holiday season. The simple, humble, and very frugal mix of cornmeal, molasses-filled syrup, and just a bit of hot oil and fat was amazing. It was especially good around the cold because this was the kind of dish you would serve to people when you really wanted them to warm up. You wouldn't even need a lot to make the cornmeal batter either. A cup of cornmeal, some salt, water, and corn kernels, or 2 tablespoons of fat. That's it. Everything else was either really optional or just there to give it a better texture and consistency, which, let's be honest, wasn't really anyone's #1 priority back then. Back then, the way people would stretch their rations and pantries was by eating things like these regularly. Actually, I bet people ate way more of the corn-based dishes you see on this list than anything else. We're on the topic of sweets. Let's talk about baked apples with cinnamon. They were the ultimate Depression-era dessert which could turn just a few apples into something that felt warm and comforting. Apples were relatively inexpensive and easy to come by, and baking them with a sprinkle of cinnamon transformed them into a dessert that made everyone feel like they were indulging. Making baked apples was as simple as coring the apples, placing them in a dish, and stuffing the centers with a mix of cinnamon, sugar, and maybe a little butter if you had some. And into the oven they'd go. In a matter of minutes, your house smelled like a bakery from dreams. The apples would soften. Their natural sweetness was enhanced by the cinnamon, and the result was a dish that felt way more luxurious than it actually was. This was a dessert that required very few ingredients, but the payoff was huge. It was warm and delicious, and made you feel like you were eating something truly special, even in the middle of hard times. Whether served on their own or with a bit of cream if you had it, baked apples with cinnamon were a simple pleasure that lifted spirits without draining the pantry. Dandelion green salad with vinegar dressing was a really practical and nutritious dish. Dandelions were things you could grow not just in your makeshift DIY backyard gardens, but were something that was simply abundant in nature. Dandelions grew everywhere. They were there in yards and fields, and that meant that people used them as much as they possibly could. People were foraging all kinds of spots in nature for any dandelions they could pick up. Every part of the thing was valuable: the greens, the roots, the seed itself. Dandelion leaves in particular were things people kept for their nutritious and medicinal properties, and like I said, if it kept the doctor away, it was something you'd have every day. The vinegar dressing, on the other hand, was something you just needed salt and vinegar for too. Throw in some corn, and you had yourself a knockout meal, really. Fried green tomatoes. No, I am not talking about the 1991 movie by the same name. They were a Depression-era favorite that took something as simple as unripe tomatoes and transformed them into a crispy, delicious dish. Tomatoes that weren't ripe yet were a common sight, and instead of letting them go to waste, people fried them up. For the preparation, you had to slice the tomatoes, coat them in cornmeal or flour, and fry until golden brown and crispy. They were a perfect combination of tangy and crunchy. The slight bitterness of the green tomatoes was balanced with the crunchy cornmeal, which made them surprisingly addicting. Again, they were a good way to get your kids to eat some veggies and fuel their bodies with healthy nutrients. As an added bonus, they were extremely cheap to make, using the ingredients everybody had on hand. Fried green tomatoes were a great way to add variety to meals during the Depression. I think this dish takes the cake as the most unbelievable, because it's one thing to eat and use up old veggies that are near their expiration date. But to eat unripe fruits and vegetables, that's a whole other story. But this meal should serve as an example of how far people would go to survive in the hard times. So next we have stewed tomatoes and day-old bread. Now, it was really common to still use bread that had been sitting around for a long while. You could even say it had gone stale. That was still bread, and usually it was a loaf you spent a decent amount of flour, yeast, and water on. Now, the tomatoes were an entirely other story. You would either grow these in your backyard, or you would get the canned stuff. Canned tomatoes are pretty much how we as a nation survived these crisis-filled times. It was food that you could get that was ready-made and didn't have to be refrigerated. It was built to last, and that's exactly the kind of thing people needed back then. This was really just the kind of thing that would humble you, though. It was one of those things that when people would eat, they'd realize the gravity of their situation. It also helped people find their resolve on tough days, as hard as it was to stomach day-old bread. Still, you have to hand it to the people. They really tried their best with what they had. It lasted well enough anyway. Chickpea salad was the Depression-era version of a light, protein-packed lunch that didn't break the bank. Chickpeas were cheap and easy to store, and when mixed with a few pantry staples, they became the star of a surprisingly tasty salad. All you needed were some canned or cooked chickpeas, a bit of oil, vinegar, and whatever veggies or herbs you had on hand. If you had onions, celery, or even a tomato, chop them up and toss them in. This meal felt refreshing, yet filling. The chickpeas provided protein and fiber, while the vinegar and oil dressing brought everything together with a bit of zest. Chickpea salad could be served as a side dish, or just slap it between some bread and call it a sandwich. It was perfect for when you needed a quick, no-cooking meal. It was budget-friendly and packed with nutrients. It's no surprise that people still enjoy chickpeas to this day and make an effort to incorporate them to their daily nutrition. It was and still is one of those dishes that made you feel like you were eating healthy, even though your pantry was running low on options. Egg drop soup with bread crusts was a way for people to get rid of things that were unnecessary and about to spoil. See, if you didn't want to eat what was there, what you really didn't want to do was let it go to waste. Eggs, especially, were hard enough to come by as it was. That's why rural areas typically enjoyed more eggs than others, because in urban hubs, they would just vanish as soon as they stocked the shelves and fridges with them. Rural areas with farming traditions still had chickens they could use for eggs, though, so there was always that. The base of the soup was a simple broth that used bones, vegetable leftovers, and water with basic seasonings. The bread crusts were to ensure that people used up every last bit of their bread, because if it meant you could save the good stuff for later, that was a decision you really wanted to make. Moving away from my favorite soup of all and onto something a little less. I don't want to sound mean, so I am not going to say anything at all. But it's enough to say that I am not a fan of this next one. Vegetable stir-fry with rice. It was a favorite back in the day for its low price and because it was a great way to use up any leftovers. The concept was simple. Grab a few vegetables, carrots, cabbage, onions, or whatever you had, chop them up and toss them in a hot pan with some oil. Stir-fry until everything was crispy and cooked through, and serve it over rice for a filling meal. Rice was the perfect base for any meal because it was inexpensive and went a long way. The vegetables added color, texture, and nutritional value, making it seem like it was a specialty of some sort, without too much cost or effort. If you were lucky enough to have some soy sauce or spices, you could add even more flavor, but even with just salt and pepper, this stir-fry got the job done. It was also one of those dishes that felt a little fancy because it came together so fast and tasted great, even when the pantry was looking sparse. Fisherman's stew was something that got popular because of necessity. Back then, fishermen used to be out at sea for so long that they'd often go days or sometimes even weeks without seeing home or their families. It was the cons of the job, you know? What were you going to do? Sit at home and hang your net, giving it all up because you haven't had enough time to unwind? One thing that hasn't changed about America ever is that the grind never really stops. so that certainly wasn't an option. What was an option was making the best use of whatever the catch of the day was. Sometimes you'd get shellfish or crawfish. Sometimes you'd get proper sea bass or red mullets and monkfish. If you kept some basic vegetables and seasoning with you, like red pepper, onions, cayenne, and salt, then you could still make a pretty serviceable stew. This is kind of why the term fisherman's stew is a bit of an umbrella phrase. Depending on where you are in the country or what kind of time period you're talking about, it can really mean 20 different things. Just mixing up the spices creates an entirely new dish, so imagine what it was like changing up the main star, the fish, almost every day. They were creating new stews on a daily basis without even knowing it. It caught on so much and became such an acquired taste for your average fisherman that they began having it at home too. And from there on, you can probably put 2 and 2 together. You have one really versatile dish that can work with like 15 kinds of fish, almost every seasoning in your cabinet, and every vegetable in your pantry. Stews themselves are really affordable and feed whole families while keeping everyone's health up, so it's no wonder that so many grandmas and grandpas used to serve this as lunch. Creamed corn and bacon on toast was one of the best meals to ever make for yourself. I know we've had a fair amount of toast-based dishes, but there really were so many things you could do. The format is timeless. Now, spreading bacon bits on toast isn't exactly anything we would call revolutionary, but the idea of adding creamed corn onto it as well? Now we're talking. Corn has always had an extremely warm place in most people's hearts because it's just a crop that's always there for you. It's really easy to grow, and almost every farming household or town would have an ample supply of corn. They'd dedicate a chunk of their land to it if they could, because it wasn't just good, nutritious, and free food, it was also good for trading. But you can't do any of that without a good breakfast, and that's also where corn is a great friend to have. Creamed corn with bacon on toast was also something people made sandwiches out of by adding olives, jalapenos, and other toppings to it to make it more exciting and filling. Usually, kids wouldn't really settle for just creamed corn on toast, so it was a lot easier to make a sandwich out of it for them. Boiled cactus pads, or as they're also called, nopales. In the days when the pantry was bare and the garden was dust, people turned to the desert for dinner. To think that someone looked at a prickly cactus and thought, "Yep, let's eat that." Necessity is the mother of invention, and nopales proved to be surprisingly edible and nutritious. The pads were stripped of their needles, carefully and boiled until tender, and had a tangy, almost lemony taste. They would chop them up, season them with whatever spices they had left, and serve them as a side dish. They were even thrown into stews, where their slimy texture acted as a natural thickener. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but when it came to survival, boiled cactus was a blessing in disguise. Fast forward to today, and nopales are a delicacy in Mexican cuisine. During the Dust Bowl, they weren't about taste, they were about survival. Those desperate cooks never imagined what they saw as hardship food would one day be served in trendy restaurants. Cactus pads proved that even in hard times, resourcefulness can take ouch and turn it into yum. So, like I was just telling you, Spam used to be the next big thing, and for good reason too. We had things like Spam and cheese roll-ups. A typical 70s office lunch would look like slices of Spam that had been rolled up with mustard and cheese. Now, these could either be grilled to enhance the smokiness of the Spam and make it contrast nicer with the pineapple, or you could bake it so that the cheese would melt and the mustard would mix in with it better for an overall more well-rounded flavor. All things considered, this was on the right track. It was quick, it was tasty, it was healthy, and it was also what people needed during a time where re-entering the workforce was really hard and put a lot of people out of their usual routines. The thing is, America is known for fickle trends. We'll like something one day, swear by it the next, and forget it halfway into the night. Spam and cheese roll-ups were good, but they took a sideline and started being party food more than a work lunch. On the other, bourbon and chicken wings go together like birds in the sky, or like strawberry jam and bread. They've been one of the most definable aspects of American cooking and eating ever since they were first made in New Orleans, Louisiana, which got popular for its bourbon chicken. It used to be a subset of Cajun-themed cooking, but slowly, over time, its roots got diluted, and it became more of a nationwide thing that everyone got into. One of the most popular types of bourbon whiskey was cherry bourbon, and one of the best ideas people ever had was mixing that with chicken wings to get a cherry bourbon edition of the best side dish ever known to man. The taste is impeccable. The bourbon enhances every single thing about the chicken wings, while adding a new flavor from the cherry aspect. It kind of gives it this sweet aftertaste that's not really overbearing. You know, some of the best additions and flavors to a tried and tested classic are ones that don't overstay their welcome. They don't overwhelm what you already love about the dish, they just take it a step further with the addition of something new. That's why this dish got so popular at cookouts and pot roasts and was a given if your family was having a pizza night. African American families in particular would love a big combo of chicken wings doused in cherry bourbon, because no party really felt complete without them. You might think I'm over-exaggerating because what can whiskey really do? Well, once you bake these wings to crispy perfection and then add them in a cherry bourbon BBQ sauce, you'll know just how good they are for yourself. Give it a try because it's probably the easiest recipe on this list so far. They don't call this the decade of casseroles for no reason. A vegetable and rice bake was an extremely low-effort, simple and affordable casserole that became very common among working-class families in factory towns. It was also really common in farming communities throughout most of the 1970s and 1940s because it was a very easy way to stretch lots of vegetables and rice into this family-sized portion. It did all that without really cutting into your pantry either. Rice was one of the most affordable grains you could buy, and if you had a paddy field to grow them on, then that was even better. In Southern and Midwestern households, canned and frozen vegetables were always stocked as much as they could be. They were available throughout the year, most people bought them in bulk, and they were rationed out throughout the months. Now, this could even include little bits of meat if you liked it like that, but most people decided to keep it strictly on the vegetarian side. Why? Well, there's just a lot of meat dishes, especially casseroles already. And besides, with all the vegetables that people were packing into this, it was a nutritional powerhouse. Seriously, this was the kind of thing you'd take for your kids when you wanted them to grow up big and strong and everything. Factory and mill workers were always bringing these in as there were almost always leftovers to go around. So braised beef tongue might be something you are not used to hearing, and the idea of beef tongue in general might be icky to some. Still, keep your minds open because the people back then definitely had to, and what they found out was that it is not so bad. Maybe you might be in for a culinary shakeup too? Either way, braised beef tongue was quite a popular dish that would typically be served in a casserole-like manner during World War II. Due to the war, it was very difficult for families to acquire the meats they were typically used to having, and beef tongue was rubbery and tough, but it was the best they could get. Braising it made for a softer bite and a lot of flavor, so you had all your protein and nutrition needs ticked off cheap and easy. That was a lot more than you could expect during wartime. The next thing we have on the list is salmon croquettes with creamed spinach. Now on paper, this sounds like just what you would need, right? It's salmon, so there's protein. It's creamed spinach, so you definitely have a side that's jam-packed with nutrition. I mean, it seems ideal. The kind of thing you'd always want to be eating at work. For a long time in the 80s, that was how it worked too. People, particularly those working office and desk jobs, were very fond of this kind of lunch. It was also the perfect change in flavors from what people were originally used to. However, this was probably even more reliant on advanced preparation than egg salad stuffed tomatoes. That just wouldn't work with the way so many people were re-entering the workforce in the second half of the 20th century. It basically meant that your wife would have to stay at home and do kitchen duties every day, and most wives were opting to go to work instead. Labor-intensive meals like this, as a result, just didn't last in the long haul. So today we had shrimp and sushi, and before that we had prawn, and even before that we had catfish and cod. So what came even before that? You'd be surprised, but in the 17th and 18th centuries in America, eels were really common. Early Americans absolutely loved one rendition of eel, which was Old LP, and the fishermen used to keep a sharp and keen eye out for any eel available in lakes. Whether it was local streams or popular fishing spots like Cape Cod, everyone would always gather around a fish market whenever fresh eel was in stock, because everyone wanted to make a fresh batch of eel pies for the family. Despite how tastes change severely throughout the centuries, one thing stays the same. A grandmother always loves creating new food for her children and grandchildren, and a lot of home cooks worked hard to perfect the ultimate old eel recipe that they ended up passing down throughout their families. The taste of old eel pie itself is something that's really hard to describe. It has a texture that's almost similar to apple pie, but it has a really sweet and savory taste working together at the same time. It feels like these flavors are going in opposite directions when you think about them, but in that single pie, all of them manage to sync and create something really unique. Would you ever recreate this dish in your own home, or is it too old-fashioned of a protein for you? Mock chicken legs were a working-class classic. It was a dish that was born out of the worst times of the Great Depression, and it was something that particularly shined in Rust Belt cities. It was incredibly popular among immigrant communities. So, there wasn't any actual chicken in this, but using grounded pork or even veal hoe chefs would shape the meat into the form of a drumstick. Pork was significantly cheaper than chicken, especially drumsticks, and since this was made out of round meat and relied on being shaped, even less desirable cuts could work for it. Some even used mixes of veal and pork, and others even went as far as to make their own vegetarian-based versions using mushrooms, mashed potatoes, and other vegetables. They were served alongside similar vegetables to make sure the dish was as hearty as it could be, and it was actually pretty okay for the time. It's not something that you would ever pick over an actual drumstick or something that people think really mimics the flavor too well, but for something that was made out of the most bare-bones ingredients, it was actually pretty okay. Even school children would be eating this, and church and funeral gatherings were often known to serve these as well whenever they could. One of the best things people did is that they also repurposed stale breading with this dish by using it for breadcrumbs. They would fry those in lard, and it would actually be pretty okay DIY fast food. The phrase mock crab salad sandwich might invoke images of cheap sandwiches that were built to just look like a crab sandwich, but if I've earned your trust at all so far, then keep an open mind because this is actually a wonderful example of American ingenuity. So, mock food came out as a result of the Depression. Most people just couldn't really afford things like crab or red meat or any kind of meat, really. I mean, with the war rationing and everything, you pretty much had what you could hunt in the wild and the cheap cuts of meat that no one would really buy. Mock food was a way for people to get some flavors they were sorely missing. It stayed a long while even after the Depression, since thanks to urbanization, there were less and less coastal cities, bodies of water, and more. Otherwise, there used to be a time where crab was so abundant that it was cheap. Anyway, for this mock food imitation, what people would do is use cod or haddock instead, and the salad was just a basic mayo-celery mix with French or vinegar dressing. You'd lay that on some soft rolls, and you'd actually have a pretty good dish. The thing is, mock food culture is entirely a thing of the past now, and most of these recipes have been lost. Peanut butter and banana roll-ups are way better than you might think. Despite the seemingly bad impression they make in your head, these are the perfect harmony of savory peanut butter and sweet, sweet banana. Also, it works both ways. If you don't like the texture of bananas because they're very mushy, then you'll enjoy this because more peanut butter actually makes it resemble a custard. If you're already a fan, then you'll find that the sweet richness only makes this much better. So most of the time in the 60s, people used to use flattened tortilla bread for this. Now, some people like to toast theirs, but that kind of goes against the vibe of the dessert in my opinion. How do you feel about it? Also, people were very often using this as a breakfast. It worked too. As far as breakfasts go, this is easily the most ideal one, because it gives you enough energy to last through an entire day. Some people preferred to have this in smoothie form though, but that wasn't nearly as effective as making a sandwich. Think about it. What do you get with maybe 2 sandwiches using the same amount you did for the milkshake? Exactly. And you get milk on the side? Who's ever complained about that? Besides, weird people that don't like milk. Cabbage and potato stew was a Depression-era lifesaver that filled you up without emptying your wallet. Cabbage was very cheap, and potatoes added the starchy heartiness that needed to make this stew a stick-to-your-ribs kind of meal. You'd chop up the cabbage and potatoes, toss them into a big pot with some water or broth, and let it all simmer until soft and flavorful. If you had a carrot or onion lying around, throw that in too, it wouldn't hurt. This stew surely wasn't the most glamorous meal of all, but it got the job done. Were you fed after it? Yes. So it did what it needed to do. It could feed the whole family while costing almost next to nothing. The best part, you might wonder? That big batch you made yesterday is even better tasting today. In tough times, cabbage and potato stew was the definition of comfort food. It wasn't fancy, but it was nourishing, satisfying, and made the most out of simple ingredients. Plus, cabbage could stretch for days, so this meal often became a household staple when the budget was tight. Which working man's lunch brought back the strongest memories? Drop your favorites in the comments below. Hit that like button if this trip took you back, and subscribe so you never miss another forgotten feast.